Hello, and welcome to another virtual author event at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and I'm delighted to have with me today one of my favorite authors, Regina Scott. Before we start our conversation, I just want to let you know that we do have Regina's latest book at the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we would be delighted to have you order it through us either online or by giving us a call. And now, without further ado, let me welcome Regina Scott.
Thank you, John. Delighted to be here.
Let's start with going back a little bit into your backstory. Who was Regina Scott before she became a multi published best-selling author?
Well, I always knew I wanted to be an author ever since I was a little girl, but I had this image of authors starving in the garret, so I didn't want to be that person starving. So I kept thinking I needed something else to go with the writing. So I've been a preschool teacher, I've been a before and after school care director, I've been a nanny, I've been a technical writer, I've been a scientist. And then finally, I was sort of praying about where does this all go? And I felt a very strong calling to jump in and just do it. So I queried Kensington, among others, publishers, and I ended up with a two-book deal, and it's been onward from there.
I was fascinated by your path to publication because initially you said you had done other things as career wise, and someone close to you had said to you that you call yourself a writer, but you're not really writing. Can you tell us a little bit about how that kind of prompted you into pursuing your literary career?
That was my dear husband. We hadn't been married very long, and we were talking to each other about how you define yourself as a person. And I said, "That's easy. I'm a writer." And he said, "You're not a writer. You never write." And I was so mad at him. Oh, I didn't talk to him for 2 hours. I walked around the house and I was just furious. Couldn't he tell this was my soulmate? Why couldn't he tell who I was? Um, but then I realized he was right. I kept putting all these other things in front of it. And so I decided that's it. We're going to sit down. We're going to do it. And so I did. And like I say, it ended up with the two-book deal with Kensington.
Why did you choose traditional regencies, which is what Kensington was publishing at the time, as your kind of entree point?
Um, One, I love them. I loved to read as a child. I used to say my mother. I knew it was a good book because my mother would call me to do something, and I'd be somewhere else. I'd be in Regency England. I'd be on a spaceship. I'd be in medieval England. I'd be following Frodo up the mountain. I'd be somewhere, but I wouldn't be in that little spot. And she was a big fan of Regency romance, and she always had some in the house. And one day I didn't have anything to read, and I picked up one, and I just got lost. And she had to call me by all three names to get me to to get me to stop reading and go do what she wanted me to do. So I just was hooked on that world. And at the time, there were 23 publishers publishing Regencies with print runs in the hundred thousands. And I thought, it's such a specialized area that you have to love and you have to have that voice for. And I thought I could do it. I thought it would be a good way to break in, and it turned out it was. And 37 books in the Regency later, we're still in the Regency.
Now, for those who are tuning in that might not know, can you kind of explain what a traditional Regency romance is for those?
Sure. It's in the vein along the lines of Jane Austen or Georgette Heyer. It's a time in England, the Napoleonic Wars are going on, but it's a time of elegance. It's a time of graciousness, when impeccable manners, beautiful costumes. Many of the readers of your readers may have been familiar with right now Bridgerton, which is a
Uh,
little piece of the Regency period. And so it's that time when it's just such a rich world that you want to immerse yourself in because it's just beautiful and friendly and warm. Um, and traditional regencies in general, not all of them, but traditional regencies tend to focus more on the emotions of falling in love as opposed to the sex of falling in love.
well, it's kind of like Jane Austen. It's on the dialogue and the courtship through conversations, and because in Jane Austen's time, of course, they weren't allowed outside of their chaperone's
Sure.
viewpoint. So you had to carry that romance on through words rather than deeds, I guess we'll
That's
say.
right. Witty banter, the mere touching of hands is exciting, that kind of thing. Oh, a good old fashioned romance.
Now, your first book was The Inflappable Miss Fairchild, which was
Yeah.
published in 1998.
Hmm.
And as you said, you had a really long career with traditional regencies. But as with so many things in publishing, tastes change, publishing styles change. Think people want something new and different, and the Regency market kind of dried up in the early 2000s. How did you reinvent yourself or reposition yourself as an author?
Couple different ways. One, I had read an article about how an author has a core story. If you break any book down to its essence, what's that core story? And it tends to follow through. And I thought, I didn't really think about that. So I started looking at my books, and my core story seems to be a lot of finding your place in the world. Where do you contribute? Where do your assets shine? Where can you really make an impact? And that some of that is finding the right person to love and giving your love. So I was talking to my agent, and I said, where else do you think that kind of core story resonates? And she said, oh, young adult. So I tried doing young adult for a while. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. And I remember our conversation. She said, do you think you could write a young adult book? And I said, I'm not sure what young adults think about today, but I could tell you what they're thinking about in the Regency. So I wrote young adult Regencies, and then they had an opening. They were looking for Regencies at a Christian publishing house, and so I kind of moved over there and did some Regencies. But while I was there, that Love Inspired, a Harlequin imprint, I had a story that I always wanted to tell ever since I was a little girl. And so I pitched it to my editor, and she was the first one that said, ooh, yeah, let's try that. So I wanted to tell the story based on a true historical event where right after the Civil War, brides came from the East Coast to marry bachelors here in my neck of the woods in Seattle. So I got to write 8 stories of my Mercer Bride stories, the series is called Frontier Bachelors, but they're all sort of connected to the Mercer Brides in some way or other, these ladies that came from the East Coast. So that I really enjoyed doing that. It was really fun having something set in my backyard. It's not easy to pop over to England every time you want to research something, but it was a lot easier having it right here.
And that kind of was your segue into the Western historical kind of market. So you did those stories, and then let's talk a little bit about your new venture, which is set in national parks. Your latest book is Nothing Short of Wondrous,
Yes.
which is the second in the series. The first was A Distance Too Grand. Let's see if I can put that up there. And these are set in the American West, but they have kind of a national park connection to them. How did you come up with the idea for that?
Well, I wanted to do something big. That's the only way to explain it. I wanted to do something. If we were hoping to attract the attention of Revell, my publisher today, and so I wanted to do something big. And I thought I wanted a woman, in a man's world kind of situation. And I thought, well, you don't get much bigger than the Grand Canyon. So I decided to do a story about a woman photographer who wrangles her way onto one of the first U.S. geological surveys, or U.S. Army at that time surveys, of the North Rim of the Grand Canyon. When we pitched that to Revell, my editor at the time said, would you be willing to do other stories set in the history of the national parks? And it was like, oh, twist my arm. Yeah, that would be wonderful. I'd love to do that. So then when I was researching for A Distance Too Grand, I came across this very tantalizing little tidbit of history that said that the cavalry had ridden to the rescue of Yellowstone. And I thought, I want to pull that thread and see where that goes. And that led to Nothing Short of Wondrous, which is set at the time when the U.S. Cavalry was managing Yellowstone.
Tell us a little bit more about that story, your characters, and the premise.
The story is set about a month after the cavalry arrived. And at the time, again, building on the real history of the event, the commanding officer at the time, Moses Harris, had set, he had literally millions of acres and about 80 men. What do you do? How do you protect that? And at the time, one of the reasons that the cavalry was called in is they were plagued by poachers. They were killing the game. People were defacing the monuments. They, oh, let's break a piece off of Old Faithful and bring it home, or carve our initials in this one or that one. So there was a lot. People just didn't understand. It was the first national park, and they had no conception. So they came to protect, and he divided his men into little stations all over the park. But they again, each of them had hundreds and thousands of acres to watch, and they didn't know what to do. So my hero is the leader of one of these detachments, and he's trying to figure out how does he protect this area. And in his area is a widow with a little boy who is managing one of the park hotels. And she offers to help guide him, or he convinces her to help guide him around the area so he can learn where he should be. And in turn, he will help her do some maintenance and things around the hotel that's hard for her to do as a woman. So the two of them, they each have some secrets in their past. They're a little bit hard for them to share, but they gradually become to a friendship and respect for each other as they work together to protect Yellowstone.
And I loved reading the books, especially your most recent one, because I had no idea how dangerous Yellowstone really was. You talk about like these geysers and where you have to be careful. Talk a little bit about the landscape of Yellowstone and how you navigate that.
Well, especially her area where they're set is the Lower Geyser Basin, and it has some of the hottest pools and not the biggest geyser, but some of the biggest geysers in the park. And it again, they didn't know. They didn't know. There were times when I was doing the research that I just went, they did what? There were people that said, oh, this is this big pool of hot water. We'll use it to wash our clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the geyser went off and the clothes went everywhere, into millions of little pieces. They were just shot to pieces. And they didn't understand all of those things. And so they had to learn, and they had to learn how to protect it. And I didn't think about it at the time. Here you are in this beautiful wilderness. Any other wilderness that isn't a national park, you want to build a building, you cut down a bunch of trees, right? And you either plane them or you use the logs. No cutting trees.
Oh.
Okay, no cutting trees. How do you build a fire to keep warm? How do you repair a hotel? And no hunting game. Okay, you're hundreds and hundreds of miles from a rail line or a town. Where do you get your meat? You're serving at a hotel. How do you feed these people? You can't grow food. There's not enough. You can't aerate the land, right? You can't just put up a big old farm in the middle of Yellowstone. So there were all these things that had to be navigated and figured out. So it was very interesting. I found it fascinating.
And your heroine actually has a contract for the hotel. I found, was that something based on real
Mhm.
experience?
Yes,
People, like it's like a business, I guess, or
it
something.
was the concessions. They were granted the right to do a certain thing. There was somebody who had the concession to run the boat on Lake Yellowstone, and somebody had the concession. At the time that I'm writing the story, there were lots of little, I guess today we call them mom and pop kind of little, one person, one family running hotels or little lunch station kind of things. But it was at the time when things were starting to consolidate. Like today, we have one big group that runs all the hotels and all the concessions at a national park generally. But then it was lots of little pieces trying to learn how to work together and compete against each other.
Let's talk a little bit about the research that you've done for this series. Now, fortunately, I guess before the pandemic hit, you were able to visit and actually do some hands-on. Is that correct?
For the Grand Canyon one, I had been there just recently, so that made that very real to me. It had been a while since I had visited Yellowstone, but I had. And Yellowstone in particular has an amazing amount of material online. They have digitized incredible things. I mean, they even have a sound library. You can go listen to the paint pots bubbling. I mean, it's just wonderful. You know, you can get so much out of that. And then a lot of the early work for the Cavalry has also been digitized. So I could read Moses Harris's reports of the first months and weeks, you know, or his first his report to Congress about, hey, we're here. You gave us one guide for millions of acres. Can you help me out here? You know, so it was such a wealth. It was almost, there was too much, you know, that you want to put it all in, but you know, it's not a history book, it's a story. So you have to be a little judicious there, but it was wonderful to see all that.
And as much as you find doing research, you made a point, I think, in somewhere, and you had written to someone else or done an article about doing research. You think everything is going to be there, but that's not true. Some of the smallest details you can't find. And how do you, as a writer, kind of create that illusion that it's talk about creating historical accuracy when you sometimes don't have a source?
When you don't, yes, you sometimes you can make assumptions based on the other pieces of information sort of around it, you know, but there's a danger there. If people read A Distance Too Grand, they'll find the first chapter of Nothing Short of Wondrous in the back. And if they read that chapter and they read the chapter in the published book, they might notice a slight difference. When I'm working on a book, I do enough research to make sure that the premise I have is plausible, that it would work in that situation. And then I will often do the first draft and say, ooh, I don't know that. Oh gosh, I didn't find that. And then I go look for those little nuggets, you know, to make sure I have it right. So in the initial version, the inn's famous pie is blackberry pie, because, you know, blackberries are ubiquitous, right? Turns out there are no blackberries in Yellowstone.
Oh.
Didn't find that out till I was looking for those tiny little nuggets. When exactly are blackberries ripe in Yellowstone? I want to make sure if there's a time, because I'm sort of in the fall, when would they have that? Oh, no, yet no blackberries. So it's huckleberry pie. But it is, you can make those assumptions, but you have to be careful. So it is hard. Like I say, sometimes tangential things you can make a good assumption. I'm always really, really excited when I make that kind of jump, and then later on someone finds that elusive tidbit and publishes it. I'm like, oh, I'm right. I was right. So, but it is, and sometimes if you just can't, you have to go generic. So if you cannot, for example, you want to say she was laying below the spreading arms of an oak, and you just can't find proof that the oak was there at that time, the massive tree, so sometimes you have to do that.
I agree that it's wonderful to find those little tidbits. And one of the things that I didn't know that I now know after reading your recent book is about the spurs that cavalry men wore. And I didn't realize that they could be taken away. Is that true? Or
yeah, they can,
talk
if
about
they were
spurs?
dishonored. Yeah, if they were, the cavalrymen's spurs were the sign of honor, and if they did something that they felt dishonored them, then they took their spurs away from them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that didn't happen very often. I gather they were trying to be a very honorable bunch, but yes, they could.
And your heroine in the book, too, I think is fascinating because she is a very strong woman. She has to be to survive in Yellowstone. And I think sometimes readers today have this misperception that, oh, that heroine's too modern, she's too forward, she's too all these things, when they don't realize that really women were like that back then, especially in the West. Can you talk a little bit about women in the West?
Sure. No, they had to be. Even when I was researching for my Frontier Bachelor's, the one that's set in Pioneer, Seattle, everything, all the fashion, that information I could find for what that time period of what they would have worn were all these great big crinolines. And I'm looking at those and I'm going, how do you climb up to a barn in a crinoline? how do you milk a cow in a grill? And how do so I'm very fortunate. We have a wonderful set of reenactors at Fort Nisqually here. And it's a little earlier, it's 1840, but it was a time when the skirts were starting to get wider. So at one of their events, I went up to one of the fashion ladies and said, okay, you're wearing these. Tell me, is there a crinoline underneath there? And in truth, staying completely in her world, she said, Madam, I would not speak to you of such things. But if you truly wish to know, there's a doll over there that's exactly dressed the way we would have been. So then no crinolines, But they did, they had to. They couldn't live the way. They had to be stronger. So many women were widowed, as my heroine was, very dangerous time for people in general. And so what do? You're left all alone on the frontier with 3 kids. You don't have the money to get back home. If there is a home to go back to, you figure it out. So I do think so. And I did, again, the research. There wasn't a widow, but there were a number of wives who were there with their husbands running these hotels. So that's how my heroine got there. She didn't show up as a widow. She came with her husband, who was killed. And she had the concession, so she was going to make it work for herself and her little boy.
Yeah, and especially being set in Wyoming and Yellowstone, you have a lot of, I guess, precedence because of the historical background for that state. It was the first state to grant women the right to vote. It had the first elected female official, and this was all back in the middle of the 19th century. So there were women out there doing things that we may think are too modern, but actually are quite true to their character in the time.
Absolutely. The same with my heroine in A Distance Too Grand. She's a photographer, but there were women at that time who had their own studios and were being working photographers. So it was not common, but it wasn't unknown.
Now, is there another book in the series that we can look forward to?
Yes, coming out this October is A View Most Glorious. I'm particularly excited about this one because it's set on Mount Rainier, which I can see. My house is 45 minutes from the gates, and so I can see it out on during the winter when the trees all leaf out. It's a little harder, but during the winter I can see it out my backyard, and it's near and dear to my heart. My father loved that mountain. That was his favorite place. When we were kids growing up, we were up there almost every weekend. So it was a pleasure to be able to write about that. And I got a kick out of myself because I'm writing away on the book and I got to a scene and I ran out to tell my husband, she's right there. She's like 2 blocks from me right now. So it was a lot of fun. And it was, I don't know why. I'm sure I must have learned my own city history growing up, but I didn't remember a lot of it. And so it was wonderful being able to delve into the city, the background of really where I live today. It was wonderful.
Having written so many books today as an author, can you look back to when you were first starting out and think, what do I wish I knew then that I know now as a writer? What would you tell yourself?
Don't be afraid of opportunities.
Mm.
There were times early on in my career where I'd think, oh, maybe I should try that. No. And in fact, at one point, Kensington, my publisher at the time, said, I think you're ready for single title. I think we're ready to move you up. And I said, oh, no, I'm not ready for that. No, I'm going to stay with my traditional regencies. I'm not, and that I regret that. I wonder how much farther along I would be or where my career might have gone differently if I had been willing to take a few more chances back then. So don't be afraid of those opportunities. Sometimes what's the worst that happens? You try it, it doesn't work, then you go do something else, but don't be afraid of them.
And what is your own writing process like? Are you someone that plots everything out in detail for a book? Does it change from book to book? Talk about the writing process.
Well, they talk about pantsers and plotters, right? The people who write by the seat of their pants, or they have to plot everything out. At the moment, I'm somewhere in the middle. I started out a pantser. I just would get this idea and I'd write and write and write and write. But there was a problem because at certain points I would go, oh, I'm not sure what happens next. Oh, well, on to the next one. And that doesn't get you to finish a book. And once you're published, it's a funny thing. Your publisher wants to know what the next book's going to be about. Go figure. So I became more of a plotter. I'm still not a detailed plotter. I think it would drive me insane to plot everything out. I'd know how everything went, and what would be the point of writing the book then? So my characters tend to talk to me. The more I write about them, the more they reveal about themselves. And so sometimes the first draft of a book might look a lot different from the last because I learned something in that. And then as I'm going back through, I play that up more and build on it. So I just recently changed my process, and I'm still amazed that could happen. For decades, I have been writing my first draft longhand in a blank journal.
Oh,
People find that appalling today, but to me, writing was very creative and typing was very analytical. And I found it very hard to just really free flow when I was typing. So I always wrote them longhand and then transcribed them in and edited them as I went. And it seemed like it was taking longer and longer and longer to get that first draft done. And so I thought, I wonder, could I do it on the computer? Could I rough draft on the computer? So the last story, I do a story for my fans every Christmas. So my Christmas story, I did it that way. And I just finished the first book where I did it that way. And it sped things up dramatically and it worked. And I'm still going, how did that work? But it did. So that may make a big change. But I did find a way finally to be creative at the computer.
yeah, I guess it's always kind of scary to change your process
Yeah.
because that can mess with your writing mojo. But looks like you successfully transitioned there. When I was doing a little bit of research, I discovered you mentioned something called the Blue Stalking League. Can you tell us what that might be?
That was a short-lived, unfortunately, a short-lived collaboration with a group of very talented traditional Regency authors. We were hoping to be our own tribe and kind of do some interesting things together, but it was at a time when we were all working very, very hard at trying to get to the next level in our careers. And so it didn't prove to be as perhaps beneficial as we had all hoped, but I'm still friends with most of them. They are dear ladies, Vanessa Riley and Gail Eastwood. And Gail and I and another group of authors recently started a group on Facebook called Lady Catherine's Salon, and it is for people who love traditional regencies. And so we have lovely dedicated group there. We're closing in on 800 members, and we have lovely discussions, and we bring in other authors to tell us about their books and things like that. So we're enjoying that.
And so those interested can find that on Facebook. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
What was it called again?
Lady Catherine's Salon.
I apologize because being a Luddite, you have to completely explain things to me, but that makes it easier for others. Let's take a little segue and talk about reading because I know so many authors are also readers, and especially this last year, there's been more time than we even know what to do with since we decided to read. What have you been reading that you want to share with other readers?
I recently discovered Mimi Matthews, and it's Victorian. Well, I say that as if it's an apology that it's Victorian, but it is Victorian instead of Regency, but it still has a lot of those same conventions, the society, the elegant manners, and things like that. And she does a wonderful job with making very strong, commanding heroes, and the women who aren't afraid to challenge them. And so I'm really enjoying her books. So that's been my latest find. And then Karen Whitemeyer is one of my favorites on the Western side. I really enjoy her books. She also has a deep, rich world that she builds, and her Hangers Horseman series started this year, and I'm enjoying that. I only wish they'd let her publish more than once a year.
Now, for those that might not be familiar with your work, if you had to think about it, how would you describe your writing style? What words would you use to kind of bring readers in?
I often say warm and witty. So there's a lot of banter, there's a lot of wordplay. I like a well-turned phrase, and so I hope that I bring that in the writing. And then warm, cozy, homey, but maybe with just a little touch of mystery or adventure in there.
Mhm. I would also like to talk just a little bit because I think there's this misperception about part of a genre, and I had that before I read the books about faith-based fiction. Readers who are not familiar with it tend to think it comes in one flavor, which is not really true.
No.
Faith is an important part in many of your books, but it's not like you're reading dogma. Can you talk a little bit about incorporating faith into a story?
Sure. It's for me, and I know different Christian authors do it differently. For me, it's another arc in the story. So you'll have the heroine growing as a person, you'll have the hero growing as a person, you have the plot, the external things that are forcing them along as they go, you have the love story developing, and then they each, for me, have a faith arc. Maybe they start out and God isn't a really important part of their lives, but by the end, maybe they start to think, maybe this could be something more for me. So I make it very personal to that character, and I am not in any way, shape, or form saying, well, you all better behave just that way. That's not the point of the story. It's just another aspect of their lives that I'm trying to draw out and into the story.
You've done quite a lot of events and interviews over the course of your career as an author. Have you ever wanted someone to ask you a question that they never have as a writer?
Hmm. To think here.
Okay.
Nothing comes to mind immediately. I get a kick out of the number of people who ask about my costume collection. That always seems a bit tangential. It is in my bio, but and I do have a fairly large historical costume collection, mostly Regency and some Western, and a few medievals.
So you
Um,
like, I'm not sure what the term is, but like role reenacting, or what is the
Role playing,
role playing?
or what is it they call it now? It used to be when I used to go to quite a few science fiction conventions, and then it was just costuming. Now it's cosplay.
Ah,
Um, but um, but yes, I always enjoyed going dressed up as a character from my favorite program or my favorite book or that sort of thing. So I have a number of those. And I suppose the other thing that's in all my bios and basically no one ever asked me about, and that is my love for sailing ships. So that is
I
something.
did not know that. I know that the bridal series that you set in the West, they took the ship around, and you had some scenes set as they were, I guess, going around South America. Was it?
The Horn, south, yeah, going down the end around the Horn, coming up the other side. Well, in this case, they went through the Straits of Magellan, but still, that down and up. You're right.
But I did not
uh,
know that you personally were a sailing aficionado.
oh, I love the tall ships. They're one of my favorite things, and I'm very fortunate. Here, a couple hours away, is the Grays Harbor historical seaport, and they had two ships. Sadly, the Hawaiian Chieftain looks like it's going to have to be retired. They do not have the money to refurbish it, but the Lady Washington is our state's tall ship, and it's based out. It is a replica of a late 1800 trading vessel, so it has your beautiful masts, and she's just lovely. People who have watched a lot of movies might remember her. She was used as the interceptor in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, and she was Captain Hook's ship in the series Once Upon a Time.
Mm.
So she's one of my favorites, and I've sailed on her several times, including my dear husband bought me a transept. So normally you pay for a couple hours, to go out and sail around Puget Sound or wherever she is. But you can pay to ride aboard her for a full day as she goes between stations.
Oh,
And so I sailed her up to Columbia, and that was just amazing. It was so much fun to be aboard and watching everything, and how they do things, and the sails and the ropes and all those things. And they're wonderful. I mean, they're doing everything historically correct, and everything about the ship is historically correct. But every once in a while, the real world, the today's world intrudes. For example, when they get bored and the two of the ships are going, they take leftover pancakes from breakfast and they slingshot them back and forth at each other. I keep wanting to put that in a book, slingshotting, pancakes at each other, but I just haven't figured out a way to do that yet.
be tough. Um, Now, I'm guessing you have a way readers can find out more about your books. Can you tell us how that would be? Website?
Sure. You
Uh,
can go up to my website at reginascott.com. You can find me on Facebook and Pinterest. In fact, if you are also a sailing ship fan, you will find I have a board, and I think I'm closing in on 500 pins with sailing ships, and other things about my books and historical aspects that I enjoy. And I'm also on Goodreads. So, yeah, you can check me out.
well, I can't believe this time has just flown by so quickly. We've been talking to author Regina Scott, whose most recent books are Nothing Short of Wondrous and A Distant Too Grand. She does have a third book coming out in October. Is that correct?
Yes,
Do you have a title for it yet, or is it
yes.
still?
A view most glorious.
Ooh, and that's set in her backyard, more or less. Well, thank you again, Regina. It's been delightful having you here at the Poison Pen virtually. Hopefully, someday in the near future, we might have you in person.
That would be wonderful. I'd enjoy that. Thank you, John.
And thank you for tuning in to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen.